Welcome back to My Trauma's Chronic but I'm Iconic, the podcast where we explore the depths of human emotion and uncover the transformative powers hidden within. I'm thrilled to be your host, Rosemary, and in today's episode, we embark on a journey of self-discovery and empowerment alongside a remarkable guest whose life's work has touched the lives of countless individuals around the world. Our guest today is Trevor Griffiths, an author, speaker, and the visionary founder of the Emotional Logic Centre, a pioneering organization dedicated to promoting emotional literacy and resilience on a global scale. Trevor's journey is one of resilience, redemption, and profound insight, born from crucible of personal adversity. Growing up in a tumultuous environment fraught with trauma and uncertainty, Trevor discovered the profound impact that unaddressed emotions can have on our physical, emotional, and mental health. However, rather than not doing anything, Trevor embarked on a quest for understanding, determined to unlock the secrets of emotional alchemy and transform pain into power. As a former general practitioner with a passion for preventative medicine, Trevor witnessed firsthand the devastating toll that unresolved emotional difficulties can take on individuals and families. Inspired by his own journey of healing and growth, Trevor founded the Emotional Logic Centre over 2 decades ago, with a mission to empower individuals to harness the transformative potential of their emotions and cultivate inner strength in the face of its challenges. In today's episode, we'll delve deep into Trevor's personal journey, exploring the pivotal moments that shaped his journey, led him to develop the groundbreaking emotional logic method. We'll unravel the mysteries of emotional alchemy and discover how seemingly negative emotions can be reframed as powerful catalysts for personal growth and self-discovery. Throughout our conversation, Trevor will share practical insights, real-life antidotes, and actionable strategies for embarking the full spectrum of human emotion and navigating the complexities of our inner landscape with courage and compassion. Whether you're struggling with unresolved trauma, seeking to enhance your emotional intelligence, or simply curious about the transformative power of emotions, this episode is sure to inspire and enlighten you. So grab yourself a cup of tea, get comfy, and join us on this extraordinary journey of self-discovery and empowerment. Together, we'll unlock the hidden treasures of the human heart and embark on a quest for emotional mastery unlike any other. Before we do that, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, as it allows us to continue doing the work that we're doing and making an impact on the world. So, can you share with us a bit about your background and what led you to become passionate about emotional literacy and resilience?
All right. Well, I'm 72 now, but I had a bit of a chance to reflect on my early sort of childhood years. Um, I became a doctor, a general practitioner for 25 years, and then I've left for 20 years. I've been running the Emotional Logic Centre, a training charity to help people understand their emotions better. But the background to that comes from two sources. One was I did have quite a disturbed family background, and it left me quite traumatized, but I hadn't realized that. I had nothing to compare it with at the time. I just had various sort of difficulties in my life, and coped as best I could, really. But then also, I had my ability to study. I'm quite intelligent. I have a lot of interest in health and healthcare. So there's a whole professional area that I'm learning of the way the body works, the brain works, the psychology, the humanity of people's relationships. So I learned within a professional setting how the quality of relationships between people is so formative for their character, their personality, the way they relate. It's called a systemic approach to the whole network of relationships can really have a powerful impact on the way people's lives develop. And I then was able to reflect on my own family background, where I suppose, just to give a bit of a sort of a description of that, the way that it was difficult. It was a middle class London suburb, Bromley, Beckenham, sort of Penge areas, and I had two older brothers. They were twins, 2.5 years older than me. And one of them was extremely violent, unpredictably violent. and the other one had got some brain damage, presumably in utero, and was what was then called spastic. Had a hemiplegia, hemiparesis down one side of his left side. So he had a twisted left hand and left foot, and he had fits. And so his fits were quite violent, and but the two of them were fighting all the time. And it was really quite disturbing the way the unpredictable and irrational anger and violence was coming out between them. Meant that I, as the younger brother, was having to cope with all of that unpredictability, and my parents also had problems coping with it. I like to sort of honour them in this, in that they stayed together through my childhood, even though there were lots of ups and downs. It really was extremely difficult. But nevertheless, they had their own problems, and they sometimes looked to me as the sensible one to try and resolve issues, and I was actually more in survival mode. How to make sure I wasn't getting kicked and hit and whatever. And so I learned to survive basically by pushing people away at that time. And so although I was able to study, go on and to develop my own life, I survived by always having a means of transport that I could get away from situations. And so I didn't really learn how to make relationships properly. And that became an issue for my life later on, instability in relationships. And also always expecting any situation I was in to explode. It could completely unpredictably, either, Robert having a fit or David turning violent. And it really was, extreme. Like, for example, there's a trick that people could play as school children: put a book on a half-open door, so that if somebody walks through the door, the book drops on them as it's a practical joke, not a very nice one. But Brother David, for some reason, imagine trying to put a concrete block on top of a door, and was trying to recruit me to help get this concrete block up there. And I was just saying no, with the risk that his anger would get turned against me. So it was that wariness that meant that by the time I was coming through my childhood and into more active life, later teens and early 20s and so on, I really was always expecting relationships to explode, and I couldn't trust anybody. Found I couldn't trust my parents, to be honest, in various ways. And I felt I had to bring myself up, which wasn't a very good way of moving forward into life. I found my head was sort of filled with all sorts of worries about this and that. But it was through seeing the dynamics that were ongoing within the family that in my medical training and then subsequent medical work, I didn't follow the normal path of psychiatry, of looking at the way people think in terms of mental illnesses, but I tended to look at the relational dynamics that were stressing people. And that's why I went into general practice, thinking I could most engage with people at a level that could prevent problems. Because what happened in the end was that David was an extremely intelligent and brilliant artist. He went to Cambridge to study architecture. But while there, he got heavily into marijuana, had a complete schizophrenic breakdown, and ended up having a lifetime career in mental hospitals, where he went around terrorizing people, and just as he terrorized us in the family and terrorized people at school. Having a different view on what gets diagnosed as mental illness, seeing that emerging out of a lot of inner tensions that are built up in the relational dynamics, which are basically emotional. That's what led me into exploring my patients' emotional and relational dynamics much more than most general practitioners would do. So I ended up setting up my own practice, because I was quite pioneering in my approach to medicine, what I call whole person medicine. Um, there's a whole other story alongside, parallel to this one, about spiritual development and so on. But basically, I was able to set up in my own practice. My wife came and joined me, and we employed a counsellor. We were one of the pioneering practices to get counselling into primary care. We employed a systemic family therapist. We set up a neighbourhood befriending scheme to enable people to go out so they weren't getting so isolated and lonely in the community. Very much a whole person approach, and recognizing how people's spirituality is an important part of their wholeness and their wellness. And so acknowledging whatever spirituality people had and including that within a sense of what it is that we wanted to support through the general practice. So that was, quite an interesting phase, and it worked very well for quite a long time. And it was during that time that I developed this way of looking at people's grief emotions, their losses. Because underneath, by talking with my patients, I recognized that what they were presenting as I'm depressed or anxious or I'm getting these obsessional states or my relationships are breaking down, behind that was the constant pattern of loss of things that were important to someone, which they'd actually lost them, or there was a worry that they might lose them. And I began to see that the model of bereavement that was used in the hospices for people who were relatives of those who were dying from physical illnesses was actually relevant in everyday life. The people are grieving all the time for things that are important to them, which they're at risk of losing. And so I developed this method of helping people to respect their unpleasant loss emotions, their grief emotions, not call them negative emotions, but to say they're unpleasant, but they have useful purposes to help us to adjust to difficult life situations, to challenges around things that are important to us. And that's a method that eventually got called emotional logic, the logic of a healthy adjustment process to seeing the risk of losing something. And I can go into more details, but it's more like an overview of how I got into an emotional literacy thing. It just suddenly proved really powerful to help people suddenly see themselves in a different way. They're no longer so self-critical, telling myself off for having the anger. Anger does not mean I'm a dangerous, nasty character, that there's something wrong with me. No, anger is a passion to prevent the loss of something that's really important to you. But if you don't know how to talk about things that are important to you, if people misinterpret that drive for you to prevent the loss of it as an anger and say, hey, get that under control, then you start disengaging from your own values. And we were able to help people to start respecting themselves. And it transformed lives and transformed relationships. There's a lot of background stories behind it all, but I ended up leaving clinical medicine in a crisis, I have to say. My own life had its own processes going on as well. But by then, I'd sufficiently developed emotional logic to start up this charity, and it's gone international. It's on all 5 continents now. We've got a strong schools program to try and help young people be more resilient and more adaptable and be able to talk about their emotions more constructively. It's a very different method to the one that's commonly talked about, emotion regulation. That we can talk about that perhaps, but it really is saying, no, these emotions are not just things that you need to accept and work with, and eventually they'll disappear. We're saying, no, there is vital information in these unpleasant emotions about what's really important in life. And if you can work through to naming that what's really important behind it and learn how to talk with other people, not about the emotions, not talking about your feelings, but talking about what's really important that's driving those feelings, then suddenly your relationships deepen. And there's self-respect and there's empathy and so on. Maybe I'm talking too much in response, but that's where it went. We suddenly discovered we were right dealing with what it is to be a person. what
Mm.
personal identity is, what personal wholeness is, the ability to meet somebody in relationships as an equal, rather than be overwhelmed by the power dynamics uh, of it, and so on, and overwhelmed by the emotional overload. We're able to untangle all of that. So I found that I'm personally fulfilled now, having come through a time of isolation, confusion, really not being able to get relationships right, uh, developing into a way of being able to map this emotional world in a way that not only to strengthen me, but works for other people as well. And now I train coaches and it works for them as well. And they train other people and it works for them as well. There's something in that method that is transferable. And that really gives me a joy. That's the sort of fulfillment I'm experiencing now. So is that an answer to the way you opened this up?
Yeah, I feel like you've answered the next 6, 7 questions I had at the same time.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Don't worry,
Well,
I
we've just
feel
going to greater depth behind the back. There's several background stories.
yeah, and I feel like that's definitely I feel like it's definitely necessary to hear all the thought process behind it, as well as the background and story of the person starting it. Because not only does it provide authenticity, but it also makes something really reputable in the fact that, it is evidence-based. This is from my own life. There's actual, you know, thought behind it. It's not something that, came out of thin air and just,
Mm.
was like, oh, we could try that. And I feel like you make a very valid point when it comes to um it is a very different from the traditional approach. And usually strong emotions are seen as a flaw
Yeah,
and less communicative,
yeah.
not through the healthcare, but education, specialist
Mm.
services. And I feel like once people realize that, emotions, behavior is communicative, then there'll be it solves one part of the problem.
Mm.
It's I feel like you can't go anywhere without acknowledging that, this is not there's no like malicious intent behind it. It's just the way that, your brain processes things. And it makes sense, like what people like, it doesn't make sense to me how people don't see how it makes sense. Because it's like,
Right. Yes, I got you.
yeah, it's like this person has gone through certain experiences. Of course, they're going to react another way, like a way that is seen as socially unacceptable, aggressive, whatever it may be. And then you're like, well, if they didn't react like that, you'll be having another meeting saying, oh my God, you're concerned about this person's welfare because they're not having trauma symptoms
Yes.
that are, more commonly known. It's like,
Yes, you can't have both. It's like, yeah, exactly. I really got you. There's a real gap in the middle that people haven't filled
yeah,
with a scope of understanding. Yeah, absolutely. So, people end up being so judgmental with that, or just abandoned, misunderstood. And I really like your phrase about emotions are communicative. I haven't used that word in quite that way, but that's exactly right. They are saying something about what's important in life. And just because it comes with a bit of emotional dynamic, people
yeah,
get scared. They haven't got the language, they haven't got the mental framework
yeah,
to receive that, to hold it, to slow it down and get inside it, to name what's really important.
yeah,
And yeah, and that is the problem with the way the brain works and all of that. That's so I'm quite interested in the neuropsychology of the whole thing, But people talk about let's call it the top brain, the cerebral cortex and the thinking bit, but particularly the left side names specific things. Yeah, the right side of the brain is much more grouping things together into categories by feel. Yeah, and those two halves of the brain are meant to be working together. But also, what people forget is that the emotional part of the brain is right down in the core. And the way neuroscience is being taught in schools is really worrying, because they've called that core brain the reptilian brain, or the old, and it's almost as if it's just sort of knee-jerk reactive all the time, and it's much more than that.
Mm.
It's actually, without going into the details of it, but the main point is that that's where our values are based and our emotional reactions come from, and it's pre-verbal, right? We're moved into responsiveness at that really core level in the brain, and selected through that, coming up into the top brain, we allow certain things which we then name, and we regulate them and control them. Yeah, maybe I'm being too theoretical by saying this, but if we do not connect our ability to name the dynamics that are going on, right, we end up just knee-jerk reacting. So it gets a bad reputation. But that's why we call it emotional logic. That there is reason behind these emotions, and we need to engage the top brain with our emotional brain in order to properly process what's going on here. You know, what is so important about this? Why on earth am I feeling angry? Why am I feeling ashamed? But you can't do it internally. We're actually built as human beings to be knit together into relationships. And I can say this through having come through a problem and having to work through how to make relationships and seeing what a difference it makes in my own life. But we're absolutely built to be in relationships. And things that interrupt that can traumatize it and break it and isolate people are really damaging our true human nature. But as we can bring together that thinking brain with the emotional brain, so that the emotions are not just rejected and get them under control and get them sorted, but no, we can actually extract from them what they're trying to communicate about what's important to me and what's important to you, and can we talk about what's important and how we can act on that. So emotional logic leads through to agreed action plans. It's solution focused. It leads into progress, into deciding that we're going to build a future on a named value. That's what it leads around to. It's not just regulating your emotions. It's not just accepting your feelings. It's not just talking out your feelings. It goes deeper into naming the values, or naming what's been lost, you're worried about losing, and then turning that upside down. Say, I'd only name this as a loss if it was something that I valued. Yeah, that's the trick of emotional logic. That is the absolute core of how emotional logic is different. We honor and respect the losses and the risk of loss for each individual, and that's totally unique for each individual person. Yeah, to their life situation, what's important to them, that there's a risk of being lost. As soon as you can name that, you can then take a mental step back and say, but hang on, I'd only call that a loss if it was something I valued. So this list of losses that I've written down is actually a list of my personal values.
Yeah.
Now, hang on a moment. I've got values. Most people who've been traumatized, who've been rejected, who've been abandoned, who've been neglected, they're saying, I'm of no value. They're getting messages from people around, you're of no value, and suddenly they start saying, actually, I do have values, and one of our coaches got a t-shirt made. If I have values, then I am a person of value. It said on his t-shirt. And suddenly you can respect yourself more with these grief emotions, with these loss emotions, with all the angers and the guilts and depressions and shocks and so on. Yeah.
I think it's often like difficult, when you're in a place where, you have very limited capacity. And you might end up in a psychiatric ward, and you rely on other people to make decisions on your best interests and stuff like that. And I feel like the NHS, as a whole, doesn't understand trauma, doesn't understand the effects and impact of trauma. And the people who they're more likely to they find, like, even if a person was and a person with, I don't know, drug-induced psychosis, for example, display the same behavior, is going to
Hmm.
be seen more acceptable from the person with psychosis to
Yeah.
display those behavior, and the person with trauma will be deemed as, like violent, aggressive, and whatever else they're going to call them. And it's like, but these, like, both experiences are valid. both both emotions, both people's actions are coming from a place of need.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I feel like the NHS needs to go a long way in recognizing it. And from personal experience, I've got kicked out of the psychiatric ward or transferred because of the level of aggression that I had.
Hmm.
But the level
Hmm.
of aggression that I had compared, I don't know, to the white people that were in the psychiatric ward with me was not the same.
Hmm.
Mine was way less. It's like there's other factors that's what I'm trying to say, but on the surface level, it's like if you cannot realize that trauma can give responses that are not socially acceptable,
Hmm.
how are you supposed to help them and support them and reintegrate them back into society? And I think is a really important thing for people to realize. It's You need to be patient, you need to be careful, and as somebody who's previously and continues to work with um young people, children and young people who are high risk,
Hmm.
if they hurt me in any way, I don't see it as something, a personal vendetta against me.
Hmm.
Is coming, they're unable to, it could be they're unable to communicate what they're trying to say, they're
Yeah.
overwhelmed, there's always a reason behind something. But if
Yeah.
they don't, it doesn't matter whether they know what the reason is or they don't, there's always a reason behind it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It needs to be recognized that a lot of people, especially the staff in psychiatric wards, are so aggressive,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I understand there needs to be a firm place of boundaries, but at the same time, these people are well, these people are in a place of recovery, and this is why it's not helpful to put someone in a psychiatric ward, because if this is how recovery looks like, what hope is there? And but the
Absolutely.
one thing that I do like what you mentioned was the fact that you know these emotions are valued, they are useful. It may be unpredictable, it may be, something that people are not familiar with, but it does serve a purpose.
Yeah.
And, when we had our induction conversation, we
Hmm.
did talk about, things always have a purpose, whether it's physical or, you
Yeah.
know, emotional, mental, or health related.
Hmm.
And I feel like it's society would say, physical and mental health are, you know, held now to the same
Yeah.
standards. So is that
No.
really?
Well, no, okay. No, this is a big issue. And I'm just going to preface what I'm going to say by saying I am so happy to be out of the NHS. I'm sorry, I crashed out of the NHS. I said we had a pioneering practice. We really were performing well. We had the lowest referral rate to psychiatric services of any of the practices in the area. The political system changed of the NHS. I absolutely loved the NHS to begin with. It was a huge family. It was a cooperative venture, and then the politicians and the finance got in there, and it became a managed service, and money began to rule. And
Yeah.
but without going down that line at all, the more important bit that I was having problems with is that let's take a little sidestep at the moment. Initially, the medical profession developed the diagnostic model, which works brilliantly for physical problems, right? So the medical model at core is there must be one single root cause of a whole pattern of symptoms. Yeah. So if somebody's going jaundiced and they're nauseated and so on, you can eventually find, well, there's a gallstone. If we remove the gallstone, then the jaundice will get better. Yeah. That's the medical model. They then try to transfer that onto psychological problems. If somebody's anxious, there must be a single cause. If we can find the cause, then we can remove that and their anxiety will get better. Unfortunately, it doesn't work in mental states. And because mental states are totally embedded in networks of relationships that are changing all the time. It's the unpredictability of pressures within relationships that people can't hold together into an organized form. And the emotions are an expression of what's important in life not being achieved, being challenged by all of this unpredictability that's around, or maybe not unpredictability, but the predictability. I know that if I go home now, I'm going to get whopped, you know. So how do you cope with that sort of thing? So but it's the pressures in relationships. And so it's a totally different model that's needed. And unfortunately, the NHS decided to go down the route of cognitive psychology, and the whole lot, the sort of work that we were doing got pressured. We were losing the freedoms to do what we wanted in the whole thing, and various other things were happening in my life at the time, and the whole lot collapsed. But by then, I was able to set up something that was able to look directly at this systemic relational pressuring, and people have been trained in as coaches now who take it beyond, and that's, we're able to get in at that level, but outside the NHS. Now, that was happening 20 years ago, and because of other organizations I was part of that were looking at health in terms of integrating physical, psychological, and spiritual, social, spiritual, in what does it mean to be a healthy person? I was meeting people from all around Europe and in Russia and China and so on. We were all looking together at these sorts of things. So I ended up teaching abroad, and in South Africa, emotional logic became part of a package for a trauma counseling course at a psychology degree. So it's an optional module in a psychology degree for trauma counseling. In England, I hadn't even heard of trauma, right? But in Poland, in Russia, in Germany, in South Africa, in the Middle East, they're all into trauma. And the NHS has gone down a totally different route. And I think a lot of the English-speaking cultures, America, the same sort of gone down this cognitive, where they talk about mental illness, right? They separate out the mental from the physical. Whereas in Europe and Africa and Middle East, they talk about psychosocial illness. And some people will talk about psychospiritual or social spiritual. We're knit into this whole cosmos, and we have thoughts and hopes and dreams about what the cosmos will do to us as well, or a god, if you want to personalize a god. Everyone's so different in the way they picture this biggest picture in which I can make sense of life, or in which life does not make sense, but that then gets shrunk down into, well, what is the network of relationships that I'm part of? Or there are several: my home, my family, my neighborhood, my workplace, my religious community, my racial grouping, each one is a patchwork of relationships that puts different pressures on us and gives us different hopes. It's recognizing the importance of those connections into those networks, relational networks, that gives me my identity. That's my place in the world. And as soon as you go make that shift into psychosocial, the social network and how I mentally put it all together, and the same about the spiritual, how I mentally put it together, right? They all become integrated. And I know from my studies of the way the body works and the body's immune system works, that the hormones that come from our emotions also affect our immune system. So when we're getting stressed, the steroid hormones, the adrenaline that's pumping around our body is crippling our immune system. And we see it coming out in high blood pressure problems, acid problems in the stomach, you name it, all sorts of physical illnesses. In 2 years after a bereavement from somebody who's, a really close relationship, the prime relationship, every physical illness is more common in the 2 years after bereavement. Yeah. But all the daily stresses that people have, the traumas that they're going through, is like an extended bereavement as well. So it does affect physical health. They're all tied up together, psychosocial, spiritual health. And understanding how the reality of our emotional connections appears in our body as our emotional expressions, emotional dynamics. That's the evidence of the fact of our connection, is our emotional framework. And the NHS doesn't understand that. The NHS does not understand that. It's still in a diagnostic model. Oh, you've got an anxiety state. Oh, you're depressed. You've got obsessional compulsive disorder. Or you've got a personality. Ooh, that's the big one. You've got a personality disorder. Oh, goodness me. No, we know, we KNOW, right, that much of what's called personality disorder is trauma. It's from an early age. We know it. We've worked with people. We've seen lives transformed in that way. But the staff in the NHS are under a hierarchical regime. We have tried and tried and tried to get emotional logic into the NHS, and it bounces off because it's not cognitive psychology. Yeah. It's systemic emotional dynamics. Maybe I'm talking too much about it, but it's an emotive subject. I mean, this is very frustrating. And you've obviously been in, you've experienced the consequences of that, of staff who just don't think in these terms at all,
And it's very, what I find hilarious, looking back is you're seen as, emotionally unstable, you're seen as aggressive, you're seen as, irrational. And I'm like, the staff that won't, like, when they're in restraint and they purposely hurt you or just hurt you in general, even without the restraint, that's not seen as irrational. That's not seen. It's like, so you're irrational because you're in a psychiatric ward under a section.
Yeah.
But you're not irrational because we get to like leave and come in and we work here. And as someone who works with the NHS, like there is very much, even in like local authorities, there is very much a regime.
Yes.
Like, and I'm like, when they have their scrutiny meetings about how they use their budgeting and stuff like that, you're spending so much money because you're not human, not putting the humanness into the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, and the thing is, if it's necessary, we're always going to go budget, even if we do that, but it's going to be much less because people forget to be humans. The people that you're interacting with and working are humans.
Yeah.
And if you don't treat them like humans or you treat them like some animal, like I feel like I said this in like a previous podcast, but like animals get treated better than humans.
Yeah.
And I'm like, people deserve the same care and attention. And I feel like there's two ways to go about it. You have to either be under a certain age, like probably 3, where you can have like tantrums, oh, he's overwhelmed, or she's, she's hungry. And, people are like trying to figure out the reason. When a baby, like, for a regular person, a baby's cry just seems like one cry, but to a parent or primary caregiver, there's a different cry for each need. And we are willing to go to so much different, so much different, go to many different lengths to figure out the need. But as soon as you turn past, I think, like the age of 3 to 4, then it's like, well, you're supposed to fit into society. And then when you're like 18, within that 24 hours, miraculously should change. And like at the age of like 6, 7, or even 11, 14, you're supposed to have everything figured out because you're just seen as you're misbehaving, you're doing this. Because how are they supposed to know like cause and effect if they don't, play around with cause and effect? It's like, when you get a computer, it's a new computer, it's a new model, you're not familiar with it, and you're playing around with it to figure out how it works. And, oh, if I press this, what is going to happen? What if I open this, would this other application work?
You're basically talking about how we are all exploratory creatures, not knowing exactly what consequence there's going to be. It's by feedback, constructive feedback, that we learn. And if people don't get that constructive feedback, if they're just criticized, told, get it under control, stop that, they end up isolated.
Even people with, then you go to an age where you get dementia, and then it's like, oh my god, like you get the people are more explored, not as much as they need to be, but that people are like, oh, they're distressed, they don't remember. They can they can be a bit more understanding, not as understanding as they should be,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
a bit more than age you get, before you get dementia. And I'm like, it's like the one thing, I just recently left care 8 months ago, 8 months and a day ago, but mm. and I was like, and people there's amazing members of staff that I worked with, and when I'm distressed, I might strangle them, I might bite them because I'm in a very I need to protect myself. I can't
Mhm.
remember who these people are in the moment. I need to protect myself. Who are these people touching me?
Mm. Mm.
Like, and you know, crisis over. Starting to regulate, and then overhear people writing into the reports, and they might be like, "Oh, did you mention this?" Try and check in if the person's included things. You're like, "Oh God, fuck, I hurt someone." You're like, "I'm sorry," and then and the person goes, "Oh, it happens. It happens." That level of understanding makes you want to try many different things to help you regulate. Makes it as some sort of intrinsic motivation to do things to protect other people, to actually care about the
Mm.
world around you.
Mm.
Because if somebody's caring towards you, you feel that constant, you feel that not the constant, you feel the automatic need to protect them and care for them
Mm.
the same way they've done for you.
Mm. There's marvelous phrase that I came across it was in Zimbabwe actually, but in a peace organization there, they were saying behind every behavior there's a story,
Mm.
and rather than just trying to regulate the behavior, you need to really get into the story. Now, I feel at the moment it might be helpful because I hear what you're saying that in this diagnostic type NHS where you make a diagnosis, then you've got to put in practice a therapy or restrain or whatever. Yeah, either you've got to be very young or very old for this behavior to be sort of treated with empathy.
Mm.
In the middle, there's a vast area of misunderstanding about what's driving this behavior. And so the tool that we've developed with the emotional logic is what we call a loss reaction worksheet, where we're saying that in this situation, don't try and tell me what you want or what you need or what you hope for, but tell me what you're worried you might lose in this situation, or what have you actually lost? And people, when they ask that question, they tend to say, "Oh, that's an interesting question. Never thought about it like that before." And it takes a little bit to get into it because you're not being negative by talking about losses. You're saying, "Well, I'm afraid." I mean, the obvious example we give is, we use this on courses because it's not too intense. But someone's heard about redundancy at work. Um, what do you worry about losing with that? Well, money, of course, but that's not the whole thing. The job also carries a chance of promotion. It's a reason to get up in the morning. It's a mark of pride. You got to meet friends. There's a social contact with it. So suddenly you're into half a dozen different things that you're going to lose by losing that job. And
Mm.
people might think that if I can get another job, I'll recover the money. But actually, that job may not be so satisfying as this one because of all the other hidden losses, which you haven't named because you heard, oh, I'm being made redundant. I'll have to find another job. But where people have got more complex situations, you suddenly find you've got a dozen hidden losses, 20. When someone's had an abuse history, 3 pages, 3 A4 pages of hidden losses of things that were important to them in life that have been challenged by this abusive set of relationships that they're in. And we can map each one of those named losses will have its own loss reaction. There are 7 core loss emotions: shock, which is to do with anxieties and fears, shock, denial, anger, guilt, yearning to get something back, bargaining, depressive emptiness, and then the sadness of acceptance of having to let go of things. We get people to map right now when you've listed these 20 different hidden losses in this situation, where your friend didn't turn up, and you felt abandoned by this friend, for example. Yeah. And they say, well, right at this moment, what do you feel about the loss of conversation? Well, I'm angry about that, and I'm depressed about that, and put a tick in it. And they go on down this list, and you end up with a whole pattern of ticks on the page right, on this loss reaction worksheet. And that pattern is an absolutely unique, powerful tool. We call it the powerhouse for change, because you can see there the way somebody's inner heart is tensioned as soon as I was to mention the redundancy, or to mention the friend who didn't turn up for the appointment, or to mention the abusive relationship. All of that would come out just like that. All of that pattern of emotional states would be tensioning somebody inside. And it's out of that whole pattern that they knee-jerk react. But what we can then do, we call this emotional chaos, that's going on inside someone. We then get someone to focus in on just one of those hidden losses and say, is this one that you could actually do something about in the next day or two to recover this particular thing that you value so much? And we make an action plan, agree an action plan that doesn't deny all the other bits that are there, but focuses in on something that is of value to that individual. And then all of that emotional energy can get focused into the action plan, to doing it. And that collapses the emotional chaos into the energy to take some action that will have a creative effect for somebody. Now that's a whole new way of thinking about emotional states, that all of this emotional tension that someone's carrying is their potential energy to build a future on a named value. The loss is the value. And as soon as people realize that they can map their inner state, they can have the power of choice to select one, to agree an action plan with someone so that people can know why you're doing this, because you've named the value you're trying to recover. So other people understand what you're doing and why, and they can choose to cooperate and help you if necessary. As soon as people have that ability to make those choices and decisions, they feel empowered. Went from being the victim of their emotional states and the victim of relational networks that are trapping them or isolating them, they suddenly become empowered to make choices and move forward. It's a very enriching way of moving forward in life. But this is because it's such a totally different way of looking at things. And if people don't have that mental framework of moving into an action plan, having mapped the emotional chaos and mapped the values that are behind it, the losses, and reinterpret them as values. If they don't have that mental framework, they're completely disempowered by that emotional overload in somebody else. And all they can do is step back or regulate or control it or whatever, or medicate, hoping it's just going to blank out the whole thing. Whereas actually, it's the conversational dynamics needed to name the losses, to choose that action plan, to cooperate, to see it through. That relational dynamic is the solution. That is what life's about. That people can be empowered to get into it. So that's me sort of filling out what it is that the staff in the NHS tend not to have, is that mental framework. And that is correctable. We can teach that. People, we know that we can do that. It's at the risk of saying too much, but those 7 states, what we found by doing this mapping process, which is a completely unique tool that shows somebody's core identity and helps them to see what is valuable about themselves. But when we look at the pattern of emotions, we started seeing certain patterns that showed that some people were narrowing their potential range of emotional responsiveness. They don't use all 7 of these different emotional adjustment states. And somebody who, for example, was just getting shock and anger, right, but was not visiting any of their self-questioning on guilt or the depressive emptiness or whatever, they would have a certain behavioral reaction that came out of the chemistry of shock, the chemistry of anger, churning around their body chemistry and making it do certain things. And we started calling these narrowed things where just 2 emotions were going on. We started calling them whirlpools of emotion. So that when somebody was shocked, they feel angry, and they feel angry, they feel shocked. You go round and round between these two states. Yeah. And we found, working with lots of other people, that we could map these whirlpools onto what the NHS diagnoses as common mental illnesses. Yeah. So that where depressive emptiness and guilt was coming up, that would be one type of depression. Where depressive emptiness and anger were tied up together, that would become an agitated depression that could lead on to suicidal drives and so on. Where anger and guilt went on together, that was tied up with self-harming behavior, compulsive. We could map it. In other words, the basic humanity of grieving, which you only grieve if you've loved, right? You only grieve if you've loved and you valued certain things and you see a risk you might lose those, right? Love is turned into its active mode of grieving when you see a risk of losing it. But that grieving can get complicated. It can get twisted around into these whirlpools. And that's what drives what people call common mental illnesses and socially disruptive behavior. Because one of them, the anger depression one, causes violent outbursts as well. But that's humanity. This is what you were saying, Rosemary, earlier, was that if people could recognize these violent outbursts as expressions of something important going on inside them, the story behind the behavior, they would be equipped to handle it in a totally different way. The conversations that would follow would be totally different to what happens at present, in a very dehumanized way. I don't know whether any of that's any sort of help to be saying, but yeah.
It's like, it started a lot of questions that I have. Like, my brain was turning as you were speaking.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to the NHS to take more of a emotional logic approach?
Yeah. They got locked into what they call evidence-based medicine, right? And certain types of evidence are acceptable and others aren't. And what we say is emotional logic is not a therapy, right? We are not engaging with a diagnostic model. Emotional logic is a personal development method that equips people to have creative conversations at a very human level. It restores humanity into any situation. I want to rehumanize the NHS. That's what I want to do. I don't want to add another therapy into their diagnostic system. Right? I want to cut right underneath it and say anybody who's employed in the NHS should be a human being. Right? Not just a cyber, I'm a nurse or I'm a whatever, you're not a role, you're not a number. You don't just work on protocols. You are a human being dealing with distressed human beings. And you need to have continuous professional development input that broadens your capacity to respond as a human being to human needs that are expressed in uncomfortable or distressing ways. And that isn't just the expression of pain. They're pretty good at responding to pain. No, this is emotional distress. This is social distress. So you were about to say something, Rosemary.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Right, sure. Yeah. It's so important not to see emotional logic as a therapy, right? Although we train coaches, we're very clear in our training that the healing is in the conversation. Is as you work with a client to help them name the hidden losses, to help them convert their picture of themselves into somebody who's got values that are being challenged, to help them to focus in on a small thing that they can actually put their energy into to make a difference that will actually then recruit stronger relationships. Their personality develops, they become more enabled, they become empowered. It's self-efficacy is the technical thing. They're able to manage life and build relationships. Now, that is like the foundation for all the specialist inputs that the NHS can be really good at. You see, I'm not actually saying, well, cognitive behavioral therapy run by a clinical psychologist is very powerful, but it only works for 40% of people, you know, and the rest is all about our humanity. So if you got a clinical psychologist who's also trained in emotional logic, I can be more precise than this, but if you got for that, their specialist techniques will be much more effective because they're being delivered in a context of humanity, not just at a professional distance. Here's an object patient, and I'm, putting this protocol into practice. No, no, no. Here's a human being. We are connecting at this level, and I have these specialist methods that I know can unlock certain traps that are blocking this person. We've got counselors. We trained a whole load of counselors early on, and they were saying that they could get as far in one session with emotional logic as it took them 5 or 6 sessions of non-directional Rogerian type counseling. Yeah. But once the emotional logic had honed in on what was really important for this person, they then had another 5 sessions within their 6-session contract, yeah, in which they could use all of their skills to help that person rebuild their life in a way that was uniquely responsive to them. We even had one rather naughty private counselor say that he doesn't include emotional logic until his 3rd session, because otherwise they get better too quickly. Sorry, that's a bit unfortunate, isn't it? A private counselor needs to earn money by having lots of sessions, and so on. But basically, what I'm saying is that bringing that level of humanity, that relational connection, that synergy of a conversational connection around an empathic understanding that you're a human being, I'm a human being too. I might have some professional skills, right, and you might have your personal distress, but we can connect around what's important to you and what's important to me. And now I've got these specialist techniques that I can bring in to help you as well. That's where the NHS could include emotional logic in their continuous professional development training for their staff, saying we want to rehumanize the NHS. Yeah. And then all of the specialist techniques will become more effective. Yeah, that's how I'd want to get in there. And that's the managers as well. That's
yeah,
yeah.
definitely. It's like this is, it's like recently there was this midwife on TikTok. She was like, calling on her family's behalf to book a GP appointment. It was urgent. He was a 14-year-old day baby, and it's like that receptionist said, call back at a certain time at 3 o'clock. Because that's when we do urgent appointments, whatever. And she had to go back and forth. She's like, I'm a medical care professional saying that this person needs to be seen by a GP. And then she was like, oh, I feel undervalued as not the midwife, the receptionist. Anyway, there was back and forth. Eventually, the midwife got the appointment for the baby. And she said, I'm going to get told off by my manager for giving out an appointment. It's like,
yep.
And it's like, well, and the thing is, like, I'm like, when it's your child, then you want people to react differently. Like, if the receptionist was, or if it was a manager, I'd be like, oh, I'm a manager. I do, But why is it, that human is not implemented all along the way? And I feel like, it plays a massive part in physical health problems as well as mental health, and that morality of both. And I'm like, it's and you were talking about the psychosocial model earlier, and I got introduced to the biopsychosocial model when I was doing dialectical behavioral therapy at a like well-known reputable center for children and young people. And that got introduced to me, not to be like, oh, this is how the brain works. This is it. Oh, this is a model, and the model saying that you're very likely to have a personality disorder to be diagnosed as a personality disorder at 18. And I was like, and I looked at,
I'm sorry, it's laughable, isn't it?
Yeah, it
really,
really is.
it's tragically laughable. Yeah, yeah.
And
Mm,
I looked at her, like area manager, Clarice, who was with me, and I was like, what's wrong with me? Because you don't know. You're like, how old was I? I think I was like 15. I was 15. So I had
yeah,
no idea how this worked. And I was like, and I didn't understand it because I never heard that phrase in my life
sure,
before. So
sure.
I was like, what's wrong with me? Because when they talk about being 18, I know things are a bit more serious in terms of like diagnosis and procedures and stuff like that. And I was like, what's wrong with me? But that's really, and I'm like, and they were like, there's nothing wrong with you. It's it's just saying what could happen. And I feel like they keep and you would get that diagnosis of that you have a biopsychosocial model. It's a model, it's a theory, it's not like a diagnosis, but they use it as a diagnosis to
Yeah, yeah.
indicate that you will have a personality disorder of some sort. Um, and as soon as I turned 18, and I turned 18 in November, I mean, sorry, October, I got transferred on from children to adults in November, and January, I got a diagnosis for emotionally unstable personalities.
Mm,
And it's and I was like, I said in my assessment, I said, you know what? I have autism, I have ADHD, and I have complex PTSD.
mm.
This is creating, you know, that response.
Yep,
Very,
yep.
very simple. But to like an average person, I can understand if they diagnose me, like somebody off the street diagnose me with person, emotional unstable personality disorder, but you're a medical professional.
Mm,
And I'm telling you, and you can see the diagnosis, you can see my history. And it's like, yeah, people with, neurodivergence and complex trauma can have personality disorders, but I feel like it's just so very much thrown at you as soon
mm,
as you turn 18 and you have certain diagnoses already underneath you and you have a certain level of support put into place.
mm.
Like
Yeah,
it's what they from like the way I've spoken to other people with these diagnoses and what I've got from it is he's seen as irrational. Psh,
yeah. Oh,
here's
yes.
that diagnosis. And
Yeah.
and I'm like, the only one thing that's beneficial from getting an emotionally unstable personality disorder diagnosis is the support, is if it's signposts you to get more support that you need.
Yeah,
But
and
other
then the
than
support isn't there. But then, your signposting's there, but the support isn't. They can't afford it. People are, it, it really is a huge collapse of the primary care and the psychological systems, within the NHS. I mean, I think at the biophysical level, at the extremely advanced level within hospitals, surgical, the NHS still works well. It's at the whole level of engagement with the population. And I would like to add another angle in on why I think it's gone wrong and why it's trapped and how this might be relevant to unlocking the problem. Um, they got this idea 20 years. This was going on when I was still in practice, and I watched it and I thought, oh, this is going to go wrong. Um, that it was all about information, that we needed to computerize in order to make the information transfer more efficient between people. And the idea of recording and transferring information took over from the idea that health is actually a social, communicating, conversational engagement. Lots of people would come to see their GP just to talk, right? And what happened was that the computer systems came into general practice and they gradually got more and more sophisticated and more integrated. And you had to do certain things at the beginning of the consultation. So one time it was 6 minutes for consultation, then it became 10 minutes. And one GP started joking eventually after a while, saying, when a patient comes in, you've got to record their height and the weight and the blood pressure, and got to check whether you've done this or done that, or check their medic. So you're looking at the computer screen and the patient's sitting over there. And after 6 minutes, you look at the patient and say, "Oh my goodness, you look ill." And the whole idea that there was a relationship there between doctor and patient, that's what it was all about. That the patient was known. Now, I know that's not, as I said, it was a universal requirement. Some people in cities in their working lives simply wanted to drop in, get the prescription, and get out again, right? So the system was strong enough to bear both of those together,
Yeah.
but it's got forced now down the line. It's all about information recording,
Yeah.
and the computers have taken over, and the managers have to manage computers, and the managers are under a system that is financially driven with targets, and those targets are dehumanized. So they're trapped within this information processing system now. Yeah, and that's why that's why it needs rehumanizing rather than adding another therapy into the whole thing. So that even if you are transferring information, this X-ray is going to come through, but there is sort of an element of concern for the timing of this in relation to the patient's needs.
Mm.
So I'm aware of a general practice system where the system has grown so large now, and the system they've got is that a report will come in from the hospital that needs coding, so that there's a code gone into the computer records, and then that is then passed on to the doctor to make a decision. Yeah, but that process gets overwhelmed. There are so many tests coming through that results could sit for a week waiting to be coded. So the doctor was not informed. The patient was phoning up saying, "Where's my result?" And the doctor was saying, "I don't know. The hospital still got it." Well, it wasn't. It was sitting in the general practice. Those inefficiencies were coming in all over the place
Yeah.
because it was all about information transfer and not about that personal relationship with the patient,
Yeah.
that would move appropriate timing and so on. Now, I don't know quite how to overcome that particular one, other than to raise the priority of knowing the patients, and knowing the doctors or the nurses or whoever. Yeah. And in some areas, like in cancer services, they're pretty good at that. They have worked hard on building that sort of understanding. But again, that's a specialist service and not a primary care
Yeah.
type service. Yeah.
The one thing is, I called my GP, like, I think now it's going to be like 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And it was like, you do the online form, it asks you so many questions. And doing that, and I'm like, I'm writing for medication review. And you're like not medication review, it's something to do with my sleep. It's not medication review. And you're asking me if I'm pregnant. I'm like, yeah, I can get what is necessary. And then you're asking me, oh, like so many questions that can be avoided if I just spoke directly to a GP, where they can be like, yeah, not
Yeah,
necessary.
you're right. It's because the human brain is working on a different logic to the way computers work. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a totally different logic. It's got a name. It's called Bayesian statistics. Never mind about that. Anybody who knows about it will know what Bayesian might be. But basically, the human brain, the human being, the human doctor, is working on probabilities, and he rules out, or she rules out certain things very quickly, because the pattern doesn't fit with this, the pattern doesn't fit with that. And computers can't do that so well. I mean, they might be working on some that will do that with artificial intelligence, but it's still not going to be an intuitive, relational human
Yeah.
system, even if AI, artificial intelligence, comes into primary care. I know. I also now I have to do those forms if I want to contact a GP about something, and probably like you've learned how to trick the system. You give answers that will get you through the form quickly, so that you can get things. So the whole lot's become a lie. It's become
Yeah, because of the way that my brain works,
yeah
like in the first answer, like in the first question, they'd be like, "What's wrong?" And
yeah
I write a very comprehensive answer. They'd be like,
yeah life.
"This I've done. This is the 3 questions later. What have you done?"
Yeah,
And I'm like, "I could have
no,
avoided this on the
no,
phone." And the thing is, like, I called this GP up, a new GP to me, never spoke
right?
to him, and I was, and he asked, and with that, he didn't go, "Oh, so your form says," he's like, "Yeah, you did an online form. What's going on?" It's like, and I'm like, at first I was thrown off, but the fact that and then later I realized he wanted to hear it from me instead of going through
Yeah.
the form. And I'm like that humanness,
Yes.
and he was listening to me. He wasn't like, okay, so okay, I'm gonna prescribe you this medication. We're gonna do this. We're gonna do that. And he was like, okay, I can prescribe you a higher dosage, but you need to realize it's not gonna work long term.
Mm,
You go higher and higher, but you need something more effective in place. And there was all that humanness. At the end, I'm not a very emotional person, but I was like when it comes to like doing phone
mm,
calls and stuff
mm,
like that, I nearly ended up crying because I was like that humanness. You actually listened to me.
mm.
You didn't be
Yeah.
like, okay, throw you a new medication or a higher dosage. Let's be realistic. Let's be,
Mm,
and there's a human element. And I was like, and it was that call was to do with my mental health.
yeah.
And I was like, I felt like I was like cured. I know there's no such thing. Like, I felt like I was like, fine. Forget about that. Just to have a conversation with someone who just actually listens to you. So,
Yes.
yeah, this is a 10-minute call. Goodbye. Like, yeah, I
Yeah.
have to take medication. I'm running over time. And he called me like 2 hours late.
Mm,
And I was like, with my autism, I was like, oh my God, they said they were gonna call me between this time frame. He didn't. And then the way that he spoke to me, I can like kind of know that he did that with every single patient. For that, I didn't care about the 2 hour of the lateness. It's like if you're like that with everyone, it really shows. And I feel like and then the thing that I'm worried about, like, I feel like new people is and then you get that question afterwards, is this a new GP, like just new to the medical world, where they have that patience, they start off with the patience and then it's lost because of compassion fatigue or, just being
mm,
burnt out.
mm,
And I feel like as a patient, you shouldn't be worrying about that,
mm.
about what your next care is going to be like before you even have
Uh,
an
yeah,
issue.
it's a big. I mean, we do still have connection with people who are in healthcare, and we do know some doctors who are going into it, and what I'm seeing now is that the people are still going into medicine and nursing and all of these other professions with a genuine concern, really wanting to make a difference, but they're moving into now an oppressive system, and it's trapping them, and it is putting a real barrier between them and people. People have to work through a whole load of stuff in order to make that human connection. Um, so that, in one sense, I would say by that there are signs of hopefulness still, and I think it's very important to be hopeful because I know that we've been through a phase over the last few years where people became very disillusioned about doctors and about the healthcare system and so on. So I think it's vital to have a bit of hope, and that's where I keep my hope is on this. We're using this word about rehumanizing those contacts that go beyond the information transfer, the information technology, and all the protocols into this more intuitive human sort of knowing level of, I look at you and say, my goodness, you are looking ill. What would make a difference for you? This is what the old style general practice was about. In your total life situation, which most GPs don't know about now because they haven't got that connection. But in your total life situation, what is the most important thing that you'd like to see change? Yeah, it might be a change in the dose of the medication, but it might be just being heard. And this is one of the things we came up with emotional logic. A lot of people used to think or say still that the most important human need is to be loved. But we've actually come to the view that the most important human need is to be heard. Right from the first cry at birth, we hope that the response will be loving. But even if the response is not, people would still rather stay in relationships where there's a responsiveness, yeah, because they're heard and there's a response, than be abandoned and
Yeah.
isolated and left. That people will go back to abusive relationships because at least there's some response, at least I exist in it, you know.
Mm.
But obviously we hope that people will be able to move on. And the model that I'm working with is that people become abusers or neglectors because of their own internal grief. They've picked up stuff yeah, I'm not trying to make excuses for people. I'm just saying that, right through all the generations, everyone's carrying a whole load of stuff, and we don't need to diagnose it and treat it, you know, and we don't need to prevent illness, assuming that it's going to come out as a depression or anxiety, as if that's an illness itself. No, we need to help them understand what's important to them. What's important? What are they worried about losing? That's the two core questions. This is a terrible situation you're in, but what have you lost, and what are you worried you might lose? And once you start mapping that, right, suddenly I become a human being again. It's strange in one sense. It's counterintuitive, but it works. And it works in every culture that we've taught it in. It's translated into many languages now. Um, Common humanity is being heard. What's important to you in this situation that is being challenged? And the old style general practice allowed you the time to ask that, right? The new style informational processing one, you're under pressure, but maybe it's restorable. Maybe that level of humanity of what's important to you in this situation. And I do know that in some medical schools, training doctors are trained to be asking those sorts of questions at the beginning. But whether it becomes a genuine part of their empathic practice, well, as you say, there is compassion burnout or empathy burnout that people can get. Yeah.
And I feel like it's burnout, it needs to be taken seriously as well. Because I'm like,
Yeah.
you can't do your job properly. Forget about doing the administrative tasks. But once you burnout causes compassion fatigue, and if you can't be compassionate, you can't be in a role where you're
No.
helping people.
And in a child and adolescent mental health services, I was very actively involved in trying to develop those in the part of the world where I am, believing that's the most preventive way, of helping to improve that. But again, they're just under 80 to 90% of the staff in the child and adolescent mental health service were off sick at one time. 80 to 90% of the staff. They just can't cope with the pressures that they're under. And yeah, they need a compassionate response to them, but the managerial system and the target driven system doesn't allow that human re-equipping. You go off sick, once you've been off sick for 2 weeks, you're more likely to be off for 2 months, then you're more likely to be off for 6 months. No, if you could get in early with a rehumanizing way of naming what's important to you, naming so that you're heard, your values are heard, and you know that you're heard within the managerial system and with colleagues, then that resilience will build up again, the adaptability, and perhaps a better energy to be able to cope with pressured workloads. As we were saying right at the beginning of this, if you don't have that mental framework of the psychosocial importance of emotional communications, the messages that are coming out about values through those emotions, and through that emotional behavior, if you haven't got that mental framework, you're disempowered. And that is the first step along the line to mental breakdown and burnout. If you feel disempowered and you're suddenly being confronted with a load of problems you've got no resources to cope with, to deal with, what's going to happen? You'll get squashed. But I do, yeah. So building up the strength of the workforce is important. Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that in South Africa, Russia, in the Middle East, they have this more like an approach of trauma.
Yeah.
What do you think is preventing the UK from doing the same? And why? What South Africa is seen as a third world country. So is some countries in the Middle East. How can people? What is? How do I phrase this? What is missing? Is it because the first world countries are more fast paced, more like oppressive, or what is it? Do you think?
No, okay. Really important question. So in the last 5 years, there has been a massive growth of awareness in Britain and in America of traumatization. So there's a whole movement now of things like trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed policing, trauma-informed healthcare, and so on. It is happening, right? But what I then see is this same diagnostic mental frame, not a rehumanized mental frame, right? But okay, if there are all these adverse childhood experiences that can accumulate, yeah, that build on a traumatized state, or hidden losses that are accumulating to build up this traumatizing state. Well, let's make a questionnaire, and somebody can go down the questionnaire and fill in tick boxes about whether they, I had an alcoholic parent, I had an abusive parent, I was sexually abused. Now, hang on a moment. Completing a questionnaire like that is a dehumanizing process. That's the sort of information that should come out within a compassionate conversation.
Yeah.
So that people know they're heard. The healing is in the conversation. Yeah. And the NHS, because it's stuck in this information processing diagnostic model, has twisted, what I've seen of it anyway, has twisted this trauma-informed approach into another diagnosis.
I feel like often, the word trauma-informed is so overused that
Yes.
it's this meaning.
Yes. Thank you. We're totally in agreement. Totally in agreement. And that's because they don't have the mental frame to understand trauma in terms of grief.
Yeah.
And because grief is not a diagnosis, well, we might as well stick it in there. But
yeah, that's right.
And there's no protocol for grief. Just give them 2 years to try and get over it, or go away and get over it. No, sorry. We train our emotional logic coaches to have creative conversations around naming hidden values, hidden losses, and reinterpreting them as values. Any healthcare worker could do that. Any teacher could do that. Any classroom assistant, and we train them. Where any manager could do that for a supervision session with one of their members of staff. Any of them. It's just a human skill. It's a mental frame about this is what a human being is. This is their personal identity. It's a whole set of values that have got challenged. And if we can work out what's important for them, not we tell you what's important. This is the other thing. Actually, I probably do need to say this. When I use that word values, you might notice that I always put in front of it personal values, right? It's what's important to you, in this situation. Many people are using that word values to mean what is a higher order thing that we should aspire to, like courage, like transparency, like honesty, and so on. These are the higher order values that would make a social system work well. And those are what I call aspirational values. They're very important in themselves, it's true. But if you haven't got your personal values or personal needs met, you're going to have difficulty putting energy into achieving those aspirational values. So if I'm being, abused at home, right, then it's difficult for me to be transparent at work because I've got to keep what's happening with my spouse secret. I don't want people to know that.
And it's that stability as well, this is my only source of income,
Yes.
You don't count that as, as long as there's no financial abuse happening. So social income, that's what's going to keep me safe. And I feel like it's even I feel like it's not just the NHS. I feel like all around is people. They write it for their policies, they write it for their mission statements, but they don't do it.
Yes.
And I'm like, it's great. And it's like, this is one thing. It's when we are recruiting for non-executive directors and stuff like that. And they read this mission statement. Our mission statement is not that long. It can't be more than 4 pages long.
Oh, gosh. Right. Yeah.
Whereas other people's mission statements are 10 to 15 pages. And I'm like, but can you evidence any of that? Can you, if you weren't there with your staff, Can your staff say, well, yeah, that's happening? I feel like this is being put into place. And I
Mm.
feel like you can't be about something if you don't treat your staff
Mm.
decent.
Yeah,
You're not as if you the way that if you can't treat your staff properly, you cannot go to work with other people.
mm.
That's the first step. I feel like
Yeah,
it says a lot about an employer who treats how they treat their staff. And it's that level. And I feel like like so if like some people, if you need to take a sabbatical, take a sabbatical. If you need to take annual leave, take an annual leave. If you need to retire, retire. Like it's like I feel like people don't realize the impact they're having by being the way they are,
yeah.
being like less human or being so your head is so very much in the system.
Mm.
It's like you're creating more harm than good.
It
And
becomes a critical system, doesn't it? Because yeah, the system will break down because it's not addressing the tensions that are underneath it. So at some point, some people start dropping out of the system. Yes, it is absolutely true in business systems as well. Managers and executives are, they cannot be open. They cannot show weakness to somebody else. Because the whole business will suffer. So they need to have systems in place where people can be honest and to talk about, what's important in a way that is not going to get them labeled as being anxious or depressed and go on their records as having a mental illness or whatever. The whole diagnostic approach is crippling, reintroducing humanity into business systems, into social, any sort of support system in organizations, because people don't want diagnoses to go on their records. Whereas, to say, you know, um, well, because somebody's values are being challenged, is a totally different mental framework. This it's saying that this, um, office clerk has values. That if this office clerk's values are heard, their performance will improve, and the whole office will have a different atmosphere. These are the intangibles that follow. We call it a butterfly effect. Where one person's personal values start being heard, it has some sort of radiant impact on wider social systems. This is the psychosocial sort of integration of the whole thing. Um, but if people feel they have to keep sort of silent and hidden, and they cannot talk about what's important to them, then of course everyone ends up, you know, in separate silos, or moving their computer, hot desking around, not really getting to know anybody, um, you know, because they've just become an extension of the computer. They're not people any longer.
it's
They're
like
they're
when you're nice
information.
to a receptionist.
Sorry.
It's like when you're nice to a receptionist.
Yeah.
Is they're so used to from their management to the people that come, for their services, treat them like absolute shit, really,
Mm.
really shit. And you're like, and then you say, "Good morning, how are you?" And you see a world of difference. Their face changes. They sit
Mm.
up. They're a bit more likely to be engaged. And
Yeah.
I'm like, and it shows a lot. And I
Mm.
feel like it's, yeah, I feel like it's really, I feel
Yeah.
like I feel like managers have a like there was, I went to this panel. There's like Violet Simon's distributor panel thing about mental health in entrepreneurship.
Mm.
And there was this guy, he has an organization, an app, I think. His name is James Roycroft, and he has bipolar. And it's for people with bipolar and with mental health difficulties. And he said, his investor said, so what guarantee do I have that this business will be stable?
Mm.
And he says, I don't know. I can't, that's a good question. I can't guarantee it, but just saying that to an investor or somebody like that, it's not a sign of, I personally don't see that as a sign of weakness, it's a strength.
mm,
Instead of us having problems down the line,
mm.
let's address the issues right there. And I feel like it's important. I feel like if a manager is like that, so their staff can be like that too.
Yeah,
And flexibility is so important.
absolutely. Yeah, but there's a couple of really simple questions that a manager or anybody could sort of tip into what they do. They're really simple. Um, it's oh, hi, how are you doing? Hey, and what's important for you today? What's going on? So what's important for you? And then another one is what's missing from life at the moment? What would you know? Those two questions, people can make a response in which they know they're heard, and that liberates them then to perform in whatever role they've got because their humanity is acknowledged. Yeah. And then they know that even just taking 5 minutes out by the coffee machine to say, hey, this thing that you're missing, is there anything I can do to help? Or, or what can you do to sort it out? And suddenly, conversations bubble up unpredictably. And, it doesn't have to be taking money away from company time,
Yeah.
but if people are in that sense informed about each other's humanity, the unpredictable, beneficial exchange, conversational exchange, can just make all the difference to the way life develops. So it's just that when people go through emotional logic courses, the foundation award, the coaching award, or whatever, all they're learning to do is make the most constructive response to the answers they hear when they ask those questions. That is the core of how do we get into someone's value system through what it is that is being challenged or what they feel they're losing. Yeah, because those loss emotions are not part of the problem. Those loss emotions that might come out in behavioral disturbance are actually the energy for you to put into a solution. They're the evidence that you can chase around to find that value that you're going to build a future on. And just simply that mental framework to reframe our way of understanding people's emotional behavioral reactions could transform organizations generally. Yeah, it's achievable.
Definitely. What do you believe are the most promising avenues for further research and exploration in the field of emotional literacy and resilience?
Um, yes, that's an interesting area. So I've got a background interest in the physiology of the body, the chemistry of the body. Because the chemistry that happens when somebody gets angry, for example, is very, very different to the chemistry that happens when somebody gets depressed. And if those two emotions are happening, which we tend to think the emotions are up here or, whatever, or here, but actually every cell of your body, the chemistry of every cell of the body is changing into a different pattern as you're experiencing that emotion. Yeah, it truly is a biopsychosocial and spiritual movement that's going on. And for me, when we talk about these whirlpools of emotion, that people have narrowed their response down into just those two areas, so that rather than being able to work through the whole 7 healthy adjustment process, which isn't pleasant, but it moves on to a growth cycle where people grow stronger to build a future on their values. Rather than being able to go through all of those 7, they get stuck with just 2 of them in this whirlpool. Now, most people have not clicked into this level of what a whirlpool, what emotions can do. They talk about conflicted emotions, but the idea that it's actually this drives people into behaviors that become unhealthy or socially disruptive. Yeah. Research into those whirlpools, into the chemistry of them and into the behavioral, the story behind them, I think could transform the way people look at and are able to ditch the diagnostic model around psychosocial problems. Yeah. And moving on from this concept of mental illness, yeah, into biopsychosocial in its true sense, yeah, that these concept of whirlpools, which are not only the chemistry of the body, but the way we feel and the way we communicate our feelings, yeah, so that others are picking up messages that are confusing, or we can clarify those messages. The whirlpools are really part of the big issue. That if people could really research those and evidence how learning this cycle of seven can broaden out people's responses from that whirlpool two into a more healthy all-round loss reaction leading on to the growth cycle, where we've become empowered to explore how to build a future on our named values. Yeah, that sort of thing. It's the whirlpools that trap people, and it's the whirlpools that give emotions a bad reputation. But the emotions, that each of those emotions on its own has a very useful purpose. It's part of a very healthy adjustment process. But when they go round and round and get trapped with each other, and that's a physiological thing that's happening in the body, that's why it comes out as a drive, as a knee-jerk reaction. But by understanding the process, by having that mental framework, people can catch it early before it becomes builds up into something that people are trapped. They become liberated because they know what's happening. Their power of choice to communicate at the level of their values rather than through pre-verbal behavior, yeah, will liberate them and transform life. So that may not be an answer that you're expecting about it, but I feel that for people to respect emotional experience enough to say, let's look seriously at this business of emotional dynamics, of whirlpool dynamics in the body chemistry and in our feelings, in our social messaging. Yeah. But at the moment, what's going on in schools and healthcare and all over the place, it's a twist. Forgive me, I'm doing mindfulness is being taught in a very unhelpful way at the moment, I believe. Mindfulness is being taught, it's all to do with calming and just letting those emotions, you stay with the emotions and let them calm down, which I believe saps the communicational, informational value of those emotions. Those emotions are trying to tell you something. They're trying to tell somebody else something about what's important in life. And if you just try to calm them or regulate behavior, well, okay, it's part of the solution. And we do say in emotional logic, the first stage is becoming mindful of your emotions, but not with a view to just staying with them. It's a view then to harnessing their energy into an action plan that you've been able to conversationally work out what value you're building your future on. And mindfulness, the way it's being taught at the moment, doesn't move on to those extra steps, those dynamic, transformative, personality building, identity building steps, and social network building steps. So because the view of emotions is, yes, emotions are important, but we basically just got to allow sufficient space for people to calm them and regulate them. And there are various sort of mindfulness techniques for doing that. No, that's not what mindfulness is about. Mindfulness is much, much more than that. It's much more than calming. It's moving on into a way of walking through life, fully mindful of the dynamics that you're engaged with at every point, and is staying in that connection. But that's another matter entirely, really. But what I'm saying is that the view of emotions that's being taught in the way mindfulness is being taught at the moment is unhelpful. And therefore, if you want to seriously research whirlpools of loss emotions as a driver of disruptive behavior for your own internal states and for social states and your spiritual search, then there would be real value in that. I'm not sure if that's a helpful answer, but that's certainly as I see it.
Um, like, can you can you share a moment or like experience from your work that has like reaffirmed your belief in the transformative power of emotional logic?
There's a story that I give, which people are given sort of permission for, but it's completely anonymous and so on. But there was a young woman who went to university and unfortunately attempted suicide during her first year. Came back, and I saw her with her mother in to introduce her to emotional logic. To look into, because the emotional logic, one of these whirlpools does drive people towards suicidal behavior, and so we can help people to untangle that. But to my absolute amazement, the person who actually ended up in tears in the consulting room was the mother. And it turned out that in the family, there was the mother and daughter were very concerned about the dad or husband, yeah, who was quite an isolated and rigid sort of personality. And the daughter had actually been a young carer for her father.
Yeah.
And on the daughter going to university, she had been really worried about what was going to happen to her mum and her dad. Yeah. And the mum, I think, experienced more tension without the daughter there. So what happened was that I ended up teaching both of them emotional logic, the emotional logic method. They call it the emotional logic method, which is to understand those 7 healthy stepping stones, how they fit together, how you can help to move them on, to harness the emotional, to get onto that growth cycle at the end of bargaining and acceptance. So taught them all of that, and then said, "What about, there was no way." I said, "Is there any way that your father husband could come in to talk about this?" I said, "No, there's no way he will, address this." But anyway, after about 2 or 3 months, I had a follow-up appointment with them and asked about the father. And the mother and daughter sort of looked at each other and said, he's a lot better than he was. He's changed. He's become more responsive. And what I saw, this to me was a picture of the subtle dynamics of psychosocial, the systemic impact of emotions. That as the mother and daughter became clearer in their communications about what was important in life, they were less expressing their anxiety about the husband or the father. The husband or father felt less intrusion. They're not worried about me so much, so he could naturally be more of himself. But there's a very subtle impact on his behavior. So that, that's just one example of a fairly dramatic grief response in the daughter that led on to transformation of the way the whole family dynamic worked. And that's just, one example of things. Another one I'd like to give is there's a reconciliation organization in Israel Palestine called Muzalaha. They work with Messianic Jews, so Jews who have a belief in Jesus as a Messiah, and Arab Christians, and trying to bring them together across a cultural and conflicted divide. And they were having problems with this, so we used the emotional logic method. I went out there for a couple of weeks and so on, and with translators. And we got people to map. We've got the Israeli women and the Arab women who are in this meeting. It's about 30 all in all. To use loss reaction worksheets to map what it is that they were losing, through, or worry they might lose through this conflict. What was important to them then was the other question about life that was being challenged by this. And we then got them to swap them. Right, so the Arab women were looking at the Israeli women's loss reaction worksheets and vice versa. And what they found was that over 80% of the values that they each had were identical. And they suddenly found they were looking at each other in a totally different way, that they'd become human beings again. And what they realized was that the cultural things that were going on were so separating their communities that they simply didn't know what was important for each other. They were being told, in one sense, sort of lies or misinformation, about who the other type of person was. But as soon as they start recording value, losses and values in this structure, their humanity came out. And so they could start cooperating around things that were of shared importance to them, rather than falling out and fighting about what they're being told is their differences. Yeah, so that was another example of the way the emotional logic method can transform some situations. And people have had mental breakdowns. There was somebody who's in a professional situation who had a constructive dismissal. He was put under a lot of pressure. They wanted to get rid of him from this company. He had a mental breakdown. A psychiatrist friend of his said that, with your state, you're going to be off work for a couple of years, just rest, relax, and so on. He came to see me as a GP. And I said, well, I'm not so sure about that. Let's have a look at what were the important things that are being challenged by the fact that this new boss of yours had a totally different way of working and wanted to get rid of you. What are the values? And he went through this method again of mapping the emotions and seeing his pattern, talking with his wife, so they get the conversational thing again. The healing is in the conversations around values, around hidden losses, and building action plans with his wife. Within 2 weeks of doing that, he'd recovered enough self-respect and identity and energy to start looking around for another job. A competing company snapped him up, right? And he got employed straight away with a higher salary than he'd been on before, right? And that company was able to get the benefit of his skills. So a personality issue in his previous one got turned around into a development of his whole life and a strengthening of his marriage. And that's really one of the key things I'd want to say, is that the main impact of learning this healthy adaptability process, healthy adjustment process, that all of these 7 unpleasant emotions have useful purposes that fit together into a healthy process that leads on to a growth cycle where I grow stronger through this situation. That the main outcome is not just in my own sense of well-being, but it's in a strengthening of relationships. That's the other systemic impact, and that is where people's futures lies, in being able to make those relationships and to move through life adaptably, not fixing those too rigidly, but being able to hear the other person. What's important to you in this situation? This is important to me. Can we swap notes and find common ground here, and and build on that common ground? That sort of thing. So I've seen those sorts of transformations, I would also like to say that there's something about this mapping process, the fact that there is order, there is structure underneath what seems like chaos, that really has helped people with neurodiversity. So in South Africa, not only was it used for trauma counseling, but there was a psychologist there who has neurodiverse issues in her own family. And she then set up a school for high-functioning children with Asperger's type condition. And she's now gone on and started a second school because the whole school method is built around the emotional logic way of understanding emotions, managing meltdowns, individualizing people's ways of expressing what's important to them in situations. Because people with neurodiversity are not very good at connecting their emotional feelings or whatever to, what's important. But the method, because it's semi-structured, really helps that. So, and we have lots of people who are involved in managing neurodiverse situations and families, who are using emotional logic and finding it extremely helpful. And they're able to use ways of individualizing the card systems that we use and the worksheets and the language to make it relevant to different people. That's, for me, one of the beauties is every conversation is different. Every human being's uniqueness is acknowledged in the method, and we can really encourage and enhance that. Yeah.
It's like the work that you're doing is so remarkable. And I think it must be really rewarding to see people, making so much progress in such a short amounts of time.
I tell you, it is. And it's almost like I get a double dose of it, because if I've trained a coach and then I hear a story that that coach has helped another family, I remotely feel a joy for both that coach and the family. It is a teachable system. It can spread a spreading wave of understanding, and yeah, I love it. I can't, I do perhaps talk too much about it sometimes, but it's a great way of life.
What's the most important takeaway or message you want our audience to remember from our conversation?
I would like to say that in my early years, right, it was a stressful family. At the age of 13, I was suicidal. I was saved from suicide by religious experience. I've had lots of other issues that came along the way, and recovery happens, and we can accelerate that path to personal growth, to coming through stronger. We can accelerate that path. It's called post-traumatic growth. We can accelerate the path to post-traumatic growth. That I would like to say that for me, the most takeaway message, the important takeaway message, is that no matter what mess you feel your life is stuck in, whether there are diagnosed conditions in the background, you are a human being. You have got values. You only grieve if you've loved. And we focus on the problems, but there is a way of focusing on moving forward into solutions that you would be able to pick up and move with. So I'd want to give hope, that there is a way. If I, just Google emotional logic center, you have to put emotional logic center in. That's the English spelling of center. Look at what's available there. Access it. There's loads of stuff. And just know that the coaches that we train are there because they have personally felt the benefit of it in their own lives, just as I did in mine. I might have developed method, but I developed it by working on me. And yeah, it really can lead on to growth.
Finally, what's one thing that you're grateful for today?
Now, firstly, in this conversation, I am very grateful that you have come through to a place of strength from your background, where you can give opportunities for people like me to share the solutions they've found. And that is such an encouraging thing to see. And I really honor you in doing that. Before this meeting, I attend a men's group, a men's breakfast group, sitting around a fire and having, toast. And there is so much just in that conversational level that I want to encourage people to ditch the diagnosis, see yourself as a human being, find that way of talking about what's important, and allow it happen, allow the growth to happen. And Rosemary, thank you. You're providing opportunities for people to hear that. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. It's an absolute pleasure having you on. As we draw to the conclusion of today's episode, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Trevor Griffiths for sharing his wisdoms, insight, and profound personal journey with us. Trevor, your passion for emotional literacy and resilience is truly inspiring, and your dedication to helping others unlock their inner strength is a beacon of hope in an often tumultuous world. I also want to express my gratitude to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey of discovery and growth. Your support and engagement means the world to us, and it's our sincere hope that you found value and inspiration in today's conversation. If you do enjoy our content, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, as this allows us to continue doing the work that we're doing. Remember, the journey of emotional alchemy is not always easy, but it's profoundly rewarding. As we navigate the highs and lows of life, may we always remember that every emotion, whether pleasant or unpleasant, holds within it the potential for growth, healing, and transformation. If you'd like to learn more about Trevor Griffiths and the Emotional Logic Centre, be sure to check out the links in the description. Stay iconic until next time.